Before we begin, let me put something on the table. And that is that I recognize as we talk about healing from past hurts, that that could be a challenge for some people. Excuse me, that some of us maybe react against what we think is like a overemphasis on this. We talk about early life's hurts, and we talk about how early life trauma affects people. And sometimes I realize when I talk about this, people just like roll their eyes. That there's this sense of a overreaction that we, particularly, let's say, the parents today try to do whatever they can to shield their kids from any problems or any challenges, and creating the generation of snowflakes. Okay, I get that might happen, or that might be a concern, but let's not let that deter us from the reality of what's happening in a lot of people's lives today. So if you recall, last week I actually used this graphic to show how it happens so often that the truth that we need to uphold is this sort of place in the center, and there's an error that we can fall into, or a ditch we can fall into on one side and the other. And that's the case here, where on the one hand we could fall into the error of making too much of early life trauma and sort of letting that be an excuse or whatever, over focusing on that. But we also run the risk of not paying enough attention to this, not taking this seriously enough. So as we begin, I'm going to say that every one of us has a decision to make today on the basis of what we're going to talk about, on the basis of this question of early life challenges, early life struggles. We all have a decision to make. And you're going to make a decision as you walk out of here today. All right? So the decision is this, and I'm going to draw your attention to a book by Henry Nouwen, great Christian author from the 20th century. And he wrote a book, kind of a well-known book, called The Wounded Healer. And in the book, he talks about how, and by the way, the book is especially oriented towards Christian leaders, but it's applicable to all of us because all of us have influence in some areas of our lives, right? So what he says is that all of us, as we go through life, have problems, have challenges, have pain, have struggles, and as we cooperate with God in the healing process and we grow through those struggles, that allows us to take what we've learned and how we've grown and help others. So that his idea or his ideal of a Christian leader is someone who's been wounded himself or herself and found healing from God, and then out of that is able to heal others. So I think we get this idea of the wounded healer, right? That would be the idea. We've all been wounded, we grow, we learn, and so then we become healers out of our own struggles. 2 Corinthians 1, verse 2, praise be to the God of all comfort, who comforts us so that we can then in turn comfort others with the comfort that we've received, right? God helps us, and then we receive that, and then we can share that. Here's the decision. And this is the part of the book that I think a lot of people don't like to think about. Because the flip side is, if you're not going to be a wounded healer, what he says can happen is that you become an unhealed wounder. That on the basis of your own struggles that you have not dealt with, then you do damage to the people around you. So you're aware, right, that almost every sexual abuse perpetrator or physical abuse perpetrator, pretty much all of them were themselves either sexually abused or physically abused. And not healing from that, they turn around and it's the victim to perpetrator cycle. Not healing from that, they then wind up creating problems and it inflicting that pain on other people, and not just with severe trauma that way, but in all kinds of ways. If we don't do the work of turning over all of ourselves to God and allowing God to bring transformation to us, we become difficult to live with. We become hurtful to the people around us. So the decision that each of us has to make is, okay, all these things have happened in my life, and what am I going to do about it? Am I going to just try to pretend that those things didn't happen and that those things don't affect me, and just sort of like, I don't want to be a snowflake, and then just try to go on through life and subconsciously damage other people because of our own unhealed wounds? Or are we going to do the work of transformation and then allow us to become wounded healers? I hope we decide to become wounded healers. So this message is part of a series where we're talking about 12 keys to personal spiritual renewal. And one of the sort of core issues here is that if you have mental health challenges, if you have particularly like addiction, one of the things that is essential for us to find recovery from addiction is to deal with these things. And this key then is that we make peace with our past. And here's how we phrase it. We recognize the power of early life trauma and deprivation, and we take steps to come to terms with those wounds. We can't fix deep habits or compulsions without getting below the surface and dealing with what drives them. And as someone who's worked with people in not just addiction, but trying to change whatever habit or compulsion, this is the issue. It's if we don't deal with what's under the surface, we're not going to find healing. We're not going to find lasting healing. Okay, so let me just go back to kind of where I started, because you might be thinking, come on, why do we need to talk about this stuff? What's done is done, right? That happened in the past. Why can't we just leave it there and move on with our lives? So here's a couple of reasons. First off, we can't leave it there because what's done is almost never done. In other words, the past, for many of us, is not the past because it is still shaping us today. We haven't dealt with those things, and so those experiences shape who we are. We're not letting the past be the past. See, what happens for all of us is we have billions of experiences throughout our lives. Every day we have interactions, and we have things that we see, we have things that we read, we have things that we encounter. All these experiences, all these inputs come into us, and it's kind of like ideally a Teflon experience where that nothing sticks. It just comes in and out, goes in and out of our awareness experience, and it begins to shape who we are over time. But it's like those things, they don't stick with us, except some things do, and some things we can't let go of. Some things that sort of stay with us, and they percolate in the back of our minds, and they then shape how we live. So everything that we experience then becomes influenced by this other stuff that we've not really dealt with. It's like the proverbial man who goes through the day and gets yelled at by his boss, and that's circulating around, and then he comes home and yells at his kids, not because of what the kids have done, but because of what happened earlier with his boss that he hasn't dealt with. I mean, that experience, multiplied by 1,000, is how many of us go through our lives, becoming then unhealed wounders. The past, it would be great if we could let the past be the past, but oftentimes it's not the past because we're carrying it with us. Number two, we got to deal with this because, like it or not, our early life experiences shape not only who we are, but they shape our experience. They shape our core beliefs. So I put this on social media. Some people commented on this. This is the uh, I wouldn't call it my favorite quote or one of my favorite quotes, but I feel like it's a very important quote to understand how this works in people's lives. Tian Dayton is a psychologist, and she's written a number of books about how people's emotional life plays out as they grow up, or people's experiences as children shapes their emotional life and then plays out in their adult life in terms of a variety of mental health problems. And what she says is the reason it matters what happens when you're young is that we can feel before we can think about what we're feeling. And so children before, let's say, the age of 9 or 10, they don't have the developmental capacity to understand things the way an adult does. And so they oftentimes just absorb experiences, and they then interpret who they are, how the world works, based on those experiences. They're not able to evaluate them. Example, let's say a 35-year-old guy is at work, and his boss is really angry and is yelling at him, and he completes his yelling by saying, what's the matter with you? What the blank is the matter with you? Okay? That guy who's had some life experience recognizes, this boss, he's kind of a jerk. This boss is ticked off because of things that are happening. He's feeling a lot of pressure, all these things. And then the person would also say, well, I've had a lot of other things happening in my life where I know I'm doing a good job, and so this guy is reacting in a way that is not helpful. 35-year-old guy or 35-year-old woman can interpret that experience that way because of everything else going on in their lives and because of their intellectual capacity. Let's say it's a 4-year-old girl or 4-year-old boy, and their parent or a babysitter is yelling at them, pointing their finger at them, and concludes their yelling by saying, what the H is the matter with you? See, that child does not have the capacity to, and the life experience to interpret that and to filter that information. That child just takes that in, and then that forms, with a variety of other things, that forms their perceptions of the world, that shapes their perceptions of themselves. And here's the scary part, that also shapes their perceptions of who God is and how the spiritual life works. And that's why people sometimes talk about spiritual abuse happening, because we really disrupt that for people. What happens when when we're young really shapes us in a deep way. We can't just move on finally, because if we're going to do Jesus' work in the world, if we're committed to proclaiming the gospel in all its fullness, that work is going to involve healing the sick and releasing the captives. I've talked about this before, so I won't belabor it, but Isaiah 61 is a famous chapter in the Old Testament talking about a prediction of the Messiah, that the Messiah was going to come and was going to bring salvation to people. And when Jesus began his public ministry, the first thing he did, he got up in a temple and read this verse. And then he said that this verse is being, or this prophecy is being completed through me, basically. So some people would say that this verse and the verses around here, this is sort of like Jesus' mission statement. And what he said was, the Spirit of the Sovereign Lord is on me, because the Lord has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim freedom for the captives, and release from darkness for the prisoners. There's the reality, we are in the tradition of Reformed Christianity. And one of the emphases, is that the right word? Emphases in our theological background is that we are committed to understanding Christianity, understanding the message of Christ, understanding the gospel as the announcement of and the coming of the kingdom of God, which shapes me individually and shapes society, shapes the community that I'm a part of. It transforms life. It includes, obviously, definitely includes the message of forgiveness of sins, but it also involves transformation of who I am and how this world works. And of course, we're working towards that imperfectly, and it's only going to come in its fullness in the new world. But there's this transformation, this proclaiming good news to the poor, binding up brokenhearted, proclaiming freedom for the captives, release for the darkness. Okay, that is happening, and that's the thing that we're a part of as a church. And part of that message then is helping people come to terms with the experiences of their lives and how they have not only shaped them, but misshaped them. So, how? How do we do this? How do we make peace with our past? First, it is to come to understand and accept the reality of our brokenness. This is where we need to get out of our denial or minimization. It's just to accept the reality of what's happened to us. So I remember, I'll be real personal with you. For me, it was a unique transformational experience. When I was talking earlier about how there's a certain mindset today about just leave it in the past, don't worry about it, don't be a snowflake, just move on, just minimizing that stuff. That was me for much of my early life, much of my early ministry. And I went through a period of just profound, where all of a sudden life didn't work anymore. And I went through a period of burnout, left ministry. And so one of the things, the person I was working with was a friend of and a colleague with a guy named Daniel Amen. Daniel Amen is an author, and he's an expert on the brain. And he has a theory that, or not a theory, I guess, but his idea is that the people's brains, there's a way that the way that a brain works of someone with a certain personality type is different than the way the brain works with someone who has a different personality type. And so he's scanned, I don't know, it's hundreds of thousands of brains. And he can show when they put this dye in, and then it circulates in your brain, and then they do a scan, and they can see which parts of the brain are more active and which parts of the brain are not as active. You've probably seen scans like this in articles or whatever. Okay, so what he's done is he's analyzed all these brains, and then what he says is he can look at a brain and identify this is the brain of a depressed person. This is the brain of a drug addicted person. This is the brain of a angry person or whatever. Okay, they did a scan of me. So I went to California some years ago. They do 3 scans, and then so they actually, because this guy knew Daniel Amen, he had Daniel look at the stuff and then give me this report. And so I'll say the good news is they did find a brain there. So thumbs up for that. And he said, you have the brain of a Vietnam War veteran. you have a PTSD brain. And he said, your brain looks very similar to people who've gone through, whatever. And again, without going into all the detail, part of it for me was recognition of things that had happened when I was a kid, things that had happened in ministry, that it created a pattern of brain activity which would be related to post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. And I remember, just being very, very distraught, thinking, I don't want to be someone who's like broken, screwed up in some way, right? But it was sort of like there, right in front of me. I could not ignore it because this was obvious within that scan. So each one of us, whether you get a scan or not, whether you realize it or not, whether you admit it or not, these experiences that have happened to you shape you in profound ways, for good, for ill. And if they have misshaped you, then again, you have a decision to make. We have a choice to make. And one of the decisions that people make is to say, forget about it. I don't want to know. I'm going to pretend that doesn't matter and just try to go about my life, and that does not work well. So there's a path that we can go on to find healing and restoration, but it won't happen if we don't get past this one. Recognize that, okay, these things happened, this is important, and there's something that I can and need to do if I'm going to grow through this. So the definition of trauma, so we're talking about, there's bad things that happen, there's suffering, but what's particularly important is if we go through trauma. Trauma is a medical term, and we're applying it today, especially people that talk about it today, focusing on emotional trauma, which might be defined as emotional shock, which produces a lasting effect on a person. Here's another way of looking at it. Individual trauma results from an event or a series of events or a set of circumstances that's experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening and has lasting adverse effects on the person's functioning, on their mental life, social life, emotional life, spiritual life. And so it can be something horrible, something, we call it acute trauma. It can be, going into a war zone or seeing a terrible accident or having some horrible, horrific thing happen to you. It can also be what people would call cumulative trauma or level 2 trauma, which is an ongoing pattern of things that become overwhelming. That's the issue, that it's suffering that is overwhelming to your ability to handle. And so that's where a lot of us are. One of the leaders in the whole healing from trauma movement is Bessel van der Kolk. He's written a number of books on this. One of his best is The Body Keeps the Score. And his idea is that that the experience of trauma actually affects us at a cellular level. But he says this: trauma affects the entire human organism, body, mind, brain. In PTSD, the body contributes or continues to defend against a threat that belongs to the past. After trauma, the world is experienced with a different nervous system. The survivor's energy now becomes focused on suppressing inner chaos. The brain gets very confused, and that leads to problems with excessive anger, excessive shutting down, doing things like taking drugs to make yourself feel better. And we talked about compulsive behaviors last week. So it's not just taking drugs, drinking alcohol, whatever sexual things, overeating, checking out by playing video games, excessive TV, social media use, just doing things to not feel because you're unable to deal with what you're feeling. So recognize it. Number two, get clear and honest about what healing looks like. What does it mean to find healing from the hurts of our past? There's a lot of magical thinking out there. I do work with an organization called YWAM, Youth with a Mission. It's a they're very committed to prayer and worship and seeking God for healing. And one of the questions that comes up is, okay, if I ask God for healing, how does that work? We have a worship service, and then I pray, and then I might have an emotional experience where I feel God's presence. Is that like, God snapping a finger and God's grace comes down to me, and now all of a sudden I feel better and I don't feel pain anymore? Is that how it works? Is it a matter of God somehow just magically takes the bad feelings away? I would say it's more complicated than that. That God's healing does happen, but it's in cooperation with His work in and through other people and a process that we go through. So we commit to a path of healing. We commit to a path of healing. And we're I'm aware of the time, so I'm going to go fairly quickly. But this path of healing that you and I need to be on is first involves forgiveness. Forgiving what needs to be forgiven. Forgiving the people who have hurt us. Luke 6:37, Jesus says, "Do not judge others, or you will be judged. Do not condemn others, or it will come back against you. Forgive others, and you will be forgiven." Colossians 3:13, "Bear with one another and forgive one another if any of you has a grievance against someone. Forgive as the Lord forgave you." So to forgive people does not mean that we take them, that we sort of decide that what they did was okay. Well, here's what it means. It's a conscious, deliberate decision to release your resentment towards them and to release your desire for vengeance. You're not going to try to get back at them anymore. And some of us might need to forgive ourselves. So you realize you made mistakes. And so now you can just simply say, here's a great sentence to keep in mind. If I had known then what I know now, I would have done things differently. So it's not, you can still recognize you did things that were dumb, but you could say, if I'd known then what I know now, I would have done things differently. But who do you need to forgive? They're people that have hurt you, people who've done you wrong. And to forgive them does not mean that you excuse what they did. To forgive them does not necessarily mean that you're going to now become best friends with them, hang out with them all the time. It might just mean that you just let go of your resentment towards them. And then secondly, it means mourning what needs to be mourned. The path of healing for some of us is just simply to let ourselves mourn. Jesus said, "Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted." And this is the problem that many of us have, is that we don't want to have to mourn. And so what do? We just watch TV instead. We just eat a bunch of junk food so we don't have to deal with whatever's going on. We just drink. We just use some drug. So if you might think of it this way: addiction is a strategy for many people to not have to mourn. And again, not just the typical, stereotypical drug addict, alcoholic, but Compulsive behavior is a strategy that some of us are using. We do these things so we don't have to deal with whatever these things are. And the only way to move forward is to actually mourn what needs to be mourned. And then finally, this means to accept that God loves us and cares for us. And that's what gets us back to this passage. Psalm 34. The Lord is close to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit. And we have to acknowledge that God's ways are higher than our ways. There's a mystery to human life. Some of you might say, okay, that's great, you can say that, but why would God let this terrible thing happen to me? Why is this have to happen? And there's a mystery to this that we're never going to get the why in this life. But at some point to recognize that God is caring for me and God's grace is available to me to help me work through whatever this is. So that God is close to me. God is close to you during this time. And then finally find the people, connect to the right people and the right places. People who can remind you of the truth, who can support you in your healing. That's what we want to be as a church, is to be people who can remind you of the truth and can support you in your however God is at work in your life. And then get out of relationships that keep re-traumatizing you. So, again, some of us might have difficult decisions to make there, that there are things that these are very dysfunctional. And so that's also a commitment of us as a church. We want to be a church that is not re-traumatizing people. We want to be parents that are helpful and not traumatizing our kids. So I don't know where this lands for each of us, but what is the path that you're on? Are you on that? Are you on a path of healing? And what's the next step for you?